Welcome. Hi, welcome to the Nuclear Policy Working Group's Fall Keynote Lecture. I'm Bethany Goldblum, and I'm a research engineer in the Nuclear Engineering Department at UC Berkeley, as well as a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I'm also the director of the Nuclear Policy Working Group. So the NPWG is an educational programming effort on the UC Berkeley campus designed to bring together scholars from the technical and social sciences to collaboratively explore issues in nuclear weapons policy. And we work jointly with the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium, which is a multi-institution initiative supported by the National Nuclear Security Administration to train the next generation of nuclear security experts while engaging in research and development in support of the nation's non-proliferation mission. And we do that in collaboration with U.S. DOE national laboratories. So at the NPWG, our goal is to learn about nuclear weapons policy issues from both a technical and social scientific perspective, and then to use what we've learned to produce impactful policy relevant research. So if you're a student at UC Berkeley and you're interested in this kind of thing, then please join us. It's not an exclusive group. So if you can sign up and learn with us and visit our website to get added to our newsletter or to get added to our weekly meetings. We only have one event per year that's broadcast beyond the UC Berkeley cohort. And so that's what we're bringing to you today. But before we get started, I want to introduce my co-hosts and deputy directors. So Austin Mullen is a graduate student in nuclear engineering at UC Berkeley, and Dr. Andrew Reddy is a postdoctoral scholar in political science at UC Berkeley, as well as a scientist at Sandia National Laboratories. So do you guys want to say a few words?
Sure, I can say a couple words. First off, thank you all so much for coming out and joining us here tonight. I'm very excited for the talk, as I'm sure you all are as well. I'm Austin Mullen, as Bethany said. I'm a third-year PhD student in nuclear engineering at UC Berkeley, and I am currently serving as the deputy director of the Nuclear Policy Working Group. And so I would like to re-extend the invitation to you all. If you are interested in what we talk about tonight, want to learn some more, want to dive deep into some nuclear weapons policy, please feel free to send me an email. I'll send my email address out in the chat, and you are more than welcome to come and start joining our meetings and joining our discussions with us. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Austin. Like Austin, I extend my welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us, particularly if you're on the East Coast. It's late there, we know. For those of you that are on campus, please do come to our future events. We meet weekly, and as Bethany said, you're more than welcome anytime. And having moderated a book discussion for Frank at CSIS a few months ago, I'm really looking forward to his talk and for all of you to kind of hear what he has to say. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bethany.
Okay, so here's how we're going to do things tonight. So with this webinar format, I think it's nice that we can handle a large number of attendees, but there's also a bit of trickiness with regards to the interaction. So we're going to start by turning the floor over to our speaker for prepared remarks, and you'll have the chance to interact through the Q&A box. So you can see that at the bottom of your screen, and if you click on that, then you can type in your questions there. You can do that at any time throughout the prepared remarks, but we're going to reserve time for Q&A at the end. And so the way that that'll work, if you can, when you type in your question, if you can say who you are and then where you're from, then our co-host Andrew and Austin will put those questions to Frank, and then he'll answer them as time allows after he finishes speaking. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Frank Gavin. Frank is a distinguished professor and the inaugural director of the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. And Frank was appointed the first Stanton Chair in Nuclear Security Policy Studies and Professor of Political Science at MIT before this. And then before MIT, he was a Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. He is also the Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Texas National Security Review. And his latest book came out earlier this year, Nuclear Weapons and American Grand Strategy, which we hope to learn about more tonight. So Frank, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Andrew and to Austin, and especially to Bethany. It's been, I think we met each other, I don't know, it's about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm just so impressed with the work that you do with the Nuclear Policy Working Group and the whole idea of bringing together different disciplines, particularly engineers, social scientists together. I think is really, really admirable. I'm going to try to put some slides up here. Let me see if I can find them. There they are. And typically, as a historian, I usually talk about the past, but I know that not everybody wants to talk about the past. So I've basing my comments, as Andrew very generously talked about, on a book that I just produced this year. But I'm going to try to be a little bit future oriented as well. And I look forward to the conversation as well in the Q&A. What is the big question that I'm looking at? What role will nuclear weapons play in world politics in the years to come? How should the United States adapt to how it employs nuclear weapons in its grand strategy in the decades ahead? How might new technologies that have recently emerged and will continue to appear, especially in the digital realm, affect a central role that the bomb has played in international politics and American grand strategy since 1945? These questions are, of course, of fundamental importance. They're also difficult to answer. Novel warfighting technologies emerge all the time. Throughout history, new capabilities have appeared to great acclaim, only to have less impact on the battlefield than anticipated. Other technologies unexpectedly offer surprising asymmetric, nonlinear effects that have profound consequences for the balance of power. Predictions on this front have often been misleading and even mistaken. Nuclear weapons and the technologies around them offer a particular challenge. We often know the impact of a new technology on the balance of power only after it has been used and adapted on the battlefield. Of course, we don't know this about nuclear weapons. They've only been used during conflict twice within days of each other. Of course, when the Americans dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Even nuclear crises have been rare since the earlier days of the Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. So to a certain extent, there's a lot of guesswork involved here. Even without nuclear weapons being used, however, we do suspect and know that they've had a profound impact on questions of war and peace. The precise nature of how and why the bomb has shaped international affairs is widely debated. Arguably, the most important feature of nuclear weapons is actually their non-use and the consequences of their non-use. This quality is the most profound difference between the bomb and other military capabilities. Perhaps the most important assessment to make is how with these new technologies that are emerging, as well as other factors that are increasingly shaping world politics, influence whether or not the bomb is more or less likely to be used in the future. For many decades, analysts have described, advocated for, and praised, quote, strategic stability, unquote, the situation in which nuclear weapons provide the benefits of deterrence without generating incentives for first use. While the idea of strategic stability is not without its own controversial aspects, a key question to explore, and something I'll talk about tonight, is whether or not various factors, including emerging new technologies, will cause nuclear weapons to be seen as more or less usable in the future. This talk will attempt to make sense of the complex issues surrounding the future of nuclear weapons, and it'll be broken up into three parts. First, I will briefly overview the history of nuclear weapons and highlight their unique qualities. I will also discuss the concept of strategic stability. Second, I will touch upon technological developments both within and outside the nuclear realm with an eye towards assessing their effect on international relations. Third, I will offer thoughts about how we might think about and frame the role technology plays on grand strategy and world politics more broadly. What makes nuclear weapons unique amongst military capabilities? And will they retain these unique qualities into the future? Three characteristics about nuclear weapons stand out compared to the military technologies from the past. This is in 1945. First, the level of potential destruction and death unleashed by nuclear weapons is extraordinary. Conventional strategic bombing and even land battles generated enormous casualties in the past. Once thermonuclear devices were created in the early 1950s, however, no known technology could approach the power of nuclear weapons to level whole societies. Second, nuclear weapons radically compress the amount of time for delivering such devastation. Far lower amounts of damage would take years to inflict, could now be surpassed and delivered within hours and even minutes. Third, such power, such devastating consequences could be delivered at great distances from the battlefield by dropping bombs from planes or missiles launched from the land, sea, or air. Nuclear war, unlike the battles of the past, would be devastating, sudden, and could be carried out from great distances. Now, it took some time before the consequences of nuclear weapons were fully grasped and understood. Most military technologies are assessed by asking whether they provide advantages to the attacker or the defender, or whether it was offense or defense dominant, to use political science terminology. Many technologies, of course, can be both. When you think of tanks, you can imagine where they would help the offense or where they would help the defense. Aircraft carriers, the same thing. Different analysts suggested different answers at different times for nuclear weapons. Some thought nuclear weapons would aid the offensive, whereas others thought that it would provide the defense with the greatest advantage. Nuclear weapons, it became clear over time, created a third category, all of its own, deterrence dominance. The leading school of thought on nuclear weapons pointed out that the bomb revolutionized international politics, making wars between nuclear weapon states inconceivable. Leading scholars, including Kenneth Waltz, Steve Van Ivre, Charlie Glaser, and especially Bob Jervis, were the most important advocates of this perspective, although they were building on the work of earlier strategists like Bernard Brodie. According to them, the major quality of this technology was, for those who possessed nuclear weapons and could protect them from a surprise attack, were their ability to make enemies think twice before attacking them. In other words, atomic weapons added as invasion insurance. And when you think about human history before 1945, where conquest and invasion was the phenomena that dominated military interactions and cast a shadow over all international politics, this was a profound change. Now, what states could acquire this technology and under what circumstances? Could anything be done to stop the spread of these weapons, the bomb, to new states? And once a state acquired nuclear weapons, how many of them, and in what configurations, and in what postures would be ideal to pursue their grand strategy? The Nuclear Revolution School had answers for all three of these questions. Given that a state that possesses survivable nuclear weapons is more or less invasion-proof, these weapons should be very popular among states. The technology, developed in the early and mid-1940s, should not have been out of the reach of dozens, if not scores, of developed countries in the decades that followed. Given their power and appeal, one would have expected many states to acquire the bomb. Furthermore, if you look historically, efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons should have been very difficult, if not impossible. There are very few examples, if any, looking to the past of one state or a group of states successfully stopping the spread of military technology, especially one as effective in guaranteeing a state's security and survivability as nuclear weapons. Surprisingly, however, both of these predictions were found wanting. As of today, there are only 9 states that possess the bomb. In 1960, the CIA predicted 20, 30, 40, as many as 60 states would eventually develop nuclear weapons. So the number 9 is far lower than most intelligence analysts or scholars or policymakers would have predicted. And many states who had the capability, ranging from Australia to Sweden, explored weapons programs, but ultimately took a pass. Now, this is one of the biggest and most important historical puzzles and historical stories of the Cold War. A large reason for this lower than expected number was the non-proliferations of the United States, or what I've called elsewhere, strategies of inhibition. The United States used a variety of tools, ranging from coercive threats against states seeking the bomb to establishing norms, telling people that the bomb was something that no one should want. It even worked with its bitterest enemy, the Soviet Union, to prevent its own friends, such as West Germany and Japan, from getting nuclear weapons, negotiating a set of treaties, starting with the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and whose centerpiece is the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Arguably, the most successful tool the United States deployed to limit proliferation was to offer alliances and security guarantees. States ranging from South Korea to Italy to West Germany would receive protection under America's nuclear umbrella, so long as they stayed non-nuclear themselves. Now, this is in many ways a profound transformation. In 1945, the United States had not, in its history, ever entered into a peacetime alliance. And in fact, as we know, the founding fathers and Washington and Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, and a variety of others talked again and again about how the United States should not do that. And one of the most remarkable aspects of the nuclear revolution is this complete transformation in American grand strategy, which was driven by many things, but primarily by this strategy of inhibition, this desire to keep other states from getting nuclear weapons. And I can talk about that a little bit more in Q&A. Now, how many nuclear weapons would a nuclear weapon state need, and in what configurations? The Nuclear Revolution School posited that all a state really needed were survivable nuclear forces that could unleash an unimaginable damage upon an adversary, even if they were attacked first. Now, there were lots of debates over what that actual number was. This was the so-called how much is enough debate that took place largely in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But the basic idea was that after a certain point, nuclear weapons were so devastating, their consequences so catastrophic, that as long as you had a few survivable bombs, that was going to be more than enough to deter an adversary from doing anything against you. Now, this was another area where scholars and strategists and their predictions got it wrong. If all a state needed was a survivable force, then the United States and the Soviet Union should have stopped building new forces at some point in the 1960s. They had achieved the state that strategists have called mutual vulnerability. And the predictions of these strategists and of the Nuclear Revolution School would be mutual vulnerability would be hard, if not impossible, to escape. Yet, even after they obtained this status, both countries poured hundreds of billions of dollars into nuclear weapon systems. Ironically, even after the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972, both sides actually increased and intensified their nuclear competition, particularly investing in new technologies. Now, you'd say it's an arms control treaty. They weren't supposed to build more bombs. Well, they didn't build more bombs. What they did was they focused massive resources in building new weapons, weapons that could be targeted more accurately, approach the enemy more stealthily, and escape any possible defense. These types of weapons only made sense if they were used to target the other side's nuclear weapons or to be used preemptively, not in a situation of mutual vulnerability or strategic stability. Much of this new and expensive technology surrounding nuclear systems that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, ranging from improved anti-submarine tracking and silencing, counterforce D5 missiles fired from submarines, the cruise missile and stealth bomber, and improved command control, communications and intelligence, as well as a variety of other systems, made little sense if the goal was strategic stability based on survivability. There's a puzzle here. Why did the United States pursue these expensive and arguably destabilizing technologies? And the Soviets, why did they respond in kind? Despite armed control efforts that appeared to reflect a desire for strategic stability. And as the strategist said, these weapons shouldn't have been able to provide any political leverage, given that all they would do is make the rubble bounce a little higher, as people used to say. Now, some had suggested a bureaucratic or organizational political answer. Different branches of the military, wanting the best and most expensive military equipment it could acquire, were able to lobby their congressmen and get these weapons. And there's certainly bits of elements of truth to this, but I would suggest when people give bureaucratic politics explanations, I like to point out that building weapons that can destroy the planet is not the same as deciding where a post office would be in Indiana. These bureaucratic politics, which might make sense at your sort of local level, it's hard to imagine actually hold as much sway when you're talking about the life or death of whole societies. A better answer, to my mind, could be found upon reflecting upon the first two puzzles. And that were, remember, why fewer states have acquired nuclear weapons than expected. And second, why the United States went to such great lengths, often successful, to prevent proliferation, to inhibit the spread of nuclear weapons, to keep the number of nuclear weapon states at 9 as opposed to 20, 30, or 50. For a state to forego its own nuclear weapons, it became clear they must believe that the patron state who is protecting them is willing to use the bomb on their behalf. Establishing the credibility of this promise is very, very difficult. By seeking nuclear primacy, i.e. better nuclear weapon systems in the Soviet Union, and by having strategies that allowed them, the United States, to use these weapons first, the United States believed that increased the credibility of what is essentially an incredible promise, that the United States would use and expose itself to nuclear attack to protect third countries around the world. If the United States had simply posited survivability as a goal, that it has simply accepted mutual vulnerability, a nuclear aspirant, be it Australia, be it West Germany, be it Japan, you name the country, they would have little reason to believe America's promise to defend it. Several lessons can be derived from the nuclear history of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons did revolutionize international politics. The kind of great power invasions and conquests that plagued mankind for centuries had faded into the background. And I think this is a question for today, whether nuclear deterrence will still prevent those sort of wars. Even with the increased geopolitical tensions between the United States and Russia and China, given the nuclear forces possessed by all three, it is really hard to imagine a World War I or World War II scenario. Even as we talk about dangerous crises, few people are thinking about the sort of wars that dominated the first part of the 20th century. That said, nuclear weapons have spread far more slowly than predicted, and the grand strategic priority of the United States has placed that it has placed on inhibition has been relatively successful. And it is clear the United States has not accepted mere survivability as a goal. Now that was the status, and again, there was a continuity here between the Cold War world and the non-Cold War world. The United States continued, and in fact, even increasingly prioritized its strategies of inhibition after the end of the Cold War. The question emerges today with new technologies and the return of great power politics, and arguably a position where the United States is not as powerful as it once was. What will the future hold? It's a hard question to answer. If you had told someone in 1960 that 60 years later, there would be less than 10 nuclear weapon states, that the number of overall nuclear weapons would massively increase before massively decreasing, that arms control would limit the numbers but not the technological innovation pursued, and that nuclear weapons would not have been used at any point in that 60 years, they probably would have been puzzled, and they would have been, I think, beyond grateful. Perhaps more important, one thing that has developed in that 60 years since is that nuclear weapons appear to play a far smaller role in international politics. Is that because nuclear weapons and deterrence have become accepted and permanent features of our world order? And if so, is this something that can and might change in the future, or will it persist? Over the long run, structural factors such as material wealth, geography, governance, and demographics are more likely to determine the pecking order in great power politics. Throughout history, however, new technologies and their innovative use have often transformed the battlefield and upended the military balance of power. Historically, states have competed ruthlessly to develop and adapt, defend against, and even steal new technologies to gain an edge in geopolitical competition. Innovative states can often overcome weaknesses in other forms of power. Modern Israel is a compelling example. A small state, geographically vulnerable, but possessing superior military capability and superior military technology. Nuclear weapons, unlike other technologies, have had a contradictory effect on the balance of power. On the one hand, they are an enormously powerful military tool, providing the possessor with potentially unprecedented power to destroy an adversary. That's a lot of power. On the other hand, their power is so fearsome that it can cancel out other forms of military power. A state with even a medium or even a small economy and limited conventional capabilities can, if it possesses a nuclear arsenal, deter a far larger, more powerful state from attacking it. It is also a subject of much debate whether these weapons can do much more than deter. Can a state use a bomb for coercive purposes? And if so, what factors? The numbers of weapons, the amount of relative resolve between the two competitors, the stake in the contested issue matters the most. And what role does technology play in these outcomes? When discussing nuclear weapons, it's important to take a broader view to analyze what might be called nuclear weapon systems. Atomic bombs, as I said earlier, are a relatively old technology. And since the development of thermonuclear weapons have not changed dramatically. Other technologies involving the ability to deliver weapons on targets or to discover, hide, and disable nuclear weapons have changed enormously. And that's where many of the big changes will take place in the years and decades to come. The effect of these changes on the military balance, grand strategy, and world order is contested. As a historian, I would suggest that American nuclear weapon systems have gone through at least two periods of profound technological change. After originally the bomb was developed in the mid-1940s. The first period of big change came in the late 1950s and early 1960s with the development of intercontinental missiles and satellites. During the first decade and a half of the nuclear age, nuclear bombs were delivered by airplanes with varying degree of range. Both the Soviet Union and the United States developed long-range rockets, including intercontinental missiles, which allowed them to deliver atomic weapons quickly and from great distance. These missiles could also be fired from submarines, which were hard to detect and track. Concurrently, the United States developed satellites, which in time provided a view into the location and number of nuclear weapons possessed by other countries. These changes were in many ways as revolutionary as the development of the atomic weapon itself. The second period of innovation came in the 1970s and 1980s, and it largely affected nuclear delivery systems, and I alluded to this earlier. Missiles became far more accurate. An arms race began between stealth technologies that allowed weapons to elude detection and with capabilities that were far better at locating and targeting nuclear weapons. One example was in the realm of nuclear weapons delivered by submarines, where the United States and Soviet Union both worked to escape detection of their submarines and identify and target their adversary submarines. This was perhaps one of the most intense aspects of the technological arms race in the 70s and 80s. Command, control, communications, and intelligence capabilities dramatically improved as well. Massive investments in defense against incoming nuclear missiles had far more mixed results, as we know. Now, what were the consequences of this qualitative nuclear arms race? Again, when we think about the Cold War, we sort of think of this static back and forth, but both these periods of technological change in the late 50s and early 60s, and then again in the 70s and 80s, affected greatly the U.S. Soviet rivalry. It's a contested question. There's a big historiography on the end of the Cold War, and what role this nuclear competition played is certainly controversial. In a somewhat contradictory way, some argue it was both dangerous and destabilizing and a useless waste of money. Others argue that the Soviet efforts to keep up with massive American investments in nuclear weapons technology helped expose their deep vulnerabilities and contributed to their decline and ultimately the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. A less explored idea is that since the United States possessed such a potential nuclear force, other states were dissuaded from improving their own nuclear weapon systems or pursuing nuclear weapons at all. We are currently, I would argue, and I think most would agree, in a third period of innovation in nuclear weapon systems. Improvements in stealth, detection, defense, miniaturization, speed, and accuracy continue and intensify. Computer processing capabilities have increased by orders of magnitude, allowing for far more complex, interconnected systems. Cyber, machine learning, and artificial intelligence may impact nuclear weapon systems. This is a big area of discussion and research right now. The United States is scheduled to spend over $1 trillion modernizing its nuclear weapon systems over the next 3 decades. Other nuclear powers are improving their capabilities as well. And once again, it's not the numbers that are increasing, but the quality. No doubt new technologies will emerge. A distinct feature of recent innovation is they've been adapted to non-nuclear systems. Many of the advancements that emerged from the second and more recent period of innovation have been utilized not just in nuclear weapon systems, but also in conventional weapon systems and deployed in battle. Since the first Gulf War, and escalating rapidly ever since, the face of the battlefield has been transformed by new technology, especially informational capabilities, in ways that would have been unimaginable in the past. And if you look at the history of many of these systems, had their roots in developments in nuclear weapon systems. Some advanced conventional weapons, like long-range conventional strike capabilities, may actually be used to undertake missions and targets that have been reserved for nuclear forces, or deployed in ways that make it unclear whether they are targeting an enemy's nuclear forces or our nuclear forces themselves. Many analysts worry that this blurring what was once seen as a clear red line between conventional and nuclear forces will be destabilizing. This is a phenomenon that bears much watching and thought. How will these new technologies, and particularly massive increases in computational power and effectiveness, affect the military balance of power? Related but separate, how will these technologies affect the nuclear balance? They're complicated questions. Some observers are quite concerned. Henry Kissinger, who's the namesake of the center I run and who's someone who I get to talk to about these issues quite a bit, and of course was one of the earliest scholars to recognize the profound consequences of nuclear weapons and the nuclear revolution, is now quite worried about the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning and its consequences for geopolitics and nuclear stability. The international order is, quote, now in upheaval amid a new, even more sweeping technological revolution whose consequences we have failed to fully reckon with and whose culmination may be a world relying on machines powered by data and algorithms and ungoverned by ethical or philosophical norms, unquote. That's from Henry Kissinger. And as he and Eric Schmidt warned, quote, if AI develops new weapons, strategies, and tactics by simulation and other clandestine methods, control becomes elusive, if not impossible. The opacity and also the speed of the cyber world may overwhelm current planning models. Now, there's a few things to bear in mind about cyber, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other emerging technologies when assessing their potential impact on the military balance and stability. First, one should recall that these technologies are facilitating technologies. On their own, they're not instruments of violence for the use on the battlefield, like tanks, battleships, or cannons. For the most part, these new technologies develop their military effectiveness in conjunction with kinetic capabilities. They enable kinetic force. Another characteristic is that these technologies often have dual uses, or perhaps more accurately, are driven and developed more by and for the civilian sector. These make regulating such technologies through arms control far more complicated than in the past. Many of these new technologies are part of an increasingly interdependent networks that are a feature of the globalized economy. This makes categorizing these technologies as purely national state capabilities difficult, which is something we're seeing unfold with rapid speed in the sort of splinter net, so-called splinter net situation that's developing between the United States and China. These emerging technologies offer other challenges as well. One of the keys in achieving nuclear deterrence was making one's capabilities clear. A state that hides or underplays its nuclear weapon capabilities risks losing these benefits. Exaggerating one's capabilities risks destabilizing international politics. Computational technologies, on the other hand, are far less transparent. It is hard to physically represent them without using them. And once they are used, adversaries often can quickly develop countermeasures and adapt. It's hard to imagine what armed control would look like in this circumstance. Treaties limiting the numbers and kinds of weapons are easier to verify and measure than trying to measure and control and limit algorithms. Now, what does all of this mean for grand strategy and international relations, which ultimately is what matters? Changes in technology have and will continue to shape both strategic stability and the shape of the international order. But two other forces matter as much and perhaps more on questions of war and peace, which we should always remember. The first are the changes to the international political order. In the years following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was some hope that globalization and increasing interdependence, combined with expanding norms, shared international laws, and strengthened global institutions, would dramatically decrease the risks and threat of conflict. In particular, there was an emphasis on reducing the dangers associated with weapons of mass destruction, particularly through arms control. Though by no means perfect, this period witnessed much success. Spending on militaries worldwide decreased dramatically. The number of nuclear weapons also fell sharply. and the spread of dangerous technologies was limited. Nuclear arms control treaties between Russia and the United States, as well as efforts to strengthen the worldwide nuclear nonproliferation regime, were hallmarks in this effort. And I think we can look at that 30-year period as with great success. There is reason to believe, however, that this era marked by historically impressive levels of cooperation and coordination may be over, or at least pausing, and that we've entered a new period characterized by the return of great power political rivalry and geopolitical competition. This era of renewed rivalry has several components. The first is the intensification of regional rivalries and instability. Especially in the Middle East, South Asia, and in East Asia, historical enmities have worsened, with potential for arms races and even conflict. Each of these regions holds the potential for nuclear rivalry with unknown consequences. In the Middle East, Israel is the only state with nuclear weapons, but Iran has sought and may continue to seek atomic capabilities, with the Gulf states eyeing such developments warily. In East Asia, North Korea's nuclear weapons program has generated deep concern, especially in South Korea and in Japan. Will those states seek nuclear weapons? South Korea sought nuclear weapons in the 1970s. Japan certainly has the capacity. In South Asia, both India and Pakistan possess both bitter enmity and nuclear weapons. It is unclear how these regional rivalries will develop in the next few decades, but recent trends, I think we would all agree, are not promising. These regional rivalries take place in the shadow of the return of great power political rivalry. America's relations with both Russia and China have deteriorated, and the trend lines are not promising. Russia has expressed a bitterness over a variety of American policies since the end of the Cold War, and its foreign policy under Vladimir Putin has become aggressive, as witnessed by its seizure of Crimea and its intervention in Syria. It has also violated arms control treaties while embarking on its own nuclear modernization. China's rapid economic development, combined with its assertion of both regional and global power status, has brought it into increased competition with the United States. How will the United States respond to both these regional and global challenges, and how will it affect the international nuclear order? This is another uncertain variable. The United States remains far and away the most powerful military and the bedrock of alliances and security arrangements, arguably to provide enormous international political stability. Although obviously the last 3.5, almost 4 years of the Trump administration has challenged that. It's also one of the keys to inhibiting the spread of nuclear weapons successfully. The second change is harder to grasp and quantify, but in the end may be more important. And this is one that I'm still pondering and I'm very interested in discussing with you all tonight. Nuclear weapons are increasingly, understandably, and I would argue correctly, seen as unusable, which may make them less relevant to international politics. Ironically, this may be due to the success of nuclear deterrence. The absence of nuclear war since 1945 has made the possibility of a planned nuclear detonation seem remote, if not impossible. Furthermore, global norms against not only nuclear use, but nuclear possession have increased. Nuclear deterrence, however, is premised upon at least the possibility that nuclear weapons would be used in extremis. This dilemma has always been there from the very beginning. Deterrence only works, is only effective if there's some possibility that nuclear weapons would be used. If that possibility goes away, what does that do to deterrence? And if deterrence goes away, what does that do to international politics? While geopolitical tensions have increased, how states fight and what they fight for has changed. In the past, state power was based on the size of its population, its land, and its resources. States conquered other states to obtain these resources. In the 21st century knowledge economy, it is hard to see where invasion and conquest pays. While nationalism and identity clashes may be on the rise, flattening demographics and aging societies decrease state appetites for war. The developed world is getting older. Older societies rarely like to fight. No state at present is remotely prepared to fight the kind of grinding wars of conquest, total mobilization, and attrition that marked much of the 19th and 20th century. Nor do any appear eager to see this world return. Now, that doesn't mean it can't return, right? And it doesn't mean we can't be that we shouldn't be careful. History tends to return and change with suddenness. Historically speaking, however, military budgets as a percentage of GNP are not high. The combination of a world living under a nuclear umbrella and integrated through globalization and supply chains constrains both what states want to do and what they can do in the world. That being said, however, the competition and increasing bitterness between the United States and China is challenging these suppositions. It's unclear what impact new technologies will have on this situation. On the one hand, new technologies may be able to carry out missions once reserved for nuclear weapons. Imagine this scenario. The United States launches a cyber attack to disable an adversary's ability to launch its own nuclear weapon systems. In the past, such a preemptive preventative attack could only have been achieved by launching a devastating nuclear attack with enormous casualties and damage. Such an attack would have been seen as highly dangerous and immoral at best. But what if new technologies allowed you to achieve the same result without a single casualty or even a damaged building? Strategic nuclear stability disappears in such a scenario, but it's not clear exactly what the consequences are. New technologies may also make war less likely, perhaps by increasing intelligence about capabilities or shifting states to varieties of competition that may be intense but are less likely to lead to the kind of great power wars of the past. These new technologies offer one of the biggest grand strategic choices facing the United States today and in the future. Will these new technologies replace nuclear weapons as the central military technology of the future? If not, will these emerging technologies make it more or less likely that nuclear weapons can and may be used? Should the United States invest over $1 trillion over the next 30 years on a nuclear modernization as planned, if nuclear weapons are less useful tools to achieve national interest, and if no one thinks they'll be used, and if nobody wants them used? Might these funds be better spent on new technologies such as artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, autonomous weapon systems, and robotics? And given the increasing hold of the nuclear taboo, would it be better to marry these two technologies to the nuclear mission or to actually separate them? In conclusion, the changing technological landscape is, of course, critical to understanding the military balance of power, the stability in the international system, and the appropriate grand strategy the United States should pursue to achieve its goals and interests. After a somewhat static period, these new capabilities are emerging that, on their surface, augur dramatic changes. In an uncertain world, it would be wise for the United States both to explore and develop these technologies and also prepare for the global consequences of their development. That said, it's easy to overstate the role technology plays on these issues. Technology is only a tool that is used to pursue interests. That is the major theme of my book. The technology does not drive these interests alone. One mistake nuclear analysts made in the past was to analyze and assess nuclear weapons on their own, distinct and separate from a state's political interests and goals. Nuclear strategy, arms control, proliferation, and non-proliferation, all were seen as shaped by revolutionary transformative effects of nuclear weapons. They were seen as guided and shaped by universal laws of game theory that applied over time and over space. This, I think, actually gave us a misleading picture picture of how nuclear weapons actually shaped and affected world politics and grand strategy. Politics did not go away. And by examining the goals the United States and other nuclear, non-nuclear, or near-nuclear states hope to achieve, actually helps us understand what some of these early strategists got wrong and how the security studies field often viewed these problems in misleading ways. Furthermore, there are broader trends in the international system, such as demographics and globalization, that worked with nuclear deterrence to shape the world order in ways that I don't think we've always fully incorporated into our analyses. It is not always clear that dramatic shifts in technology would necessarily overturn these other considerations. The most interesting question may be whether these technological advancements augment, replace, or are peripheral to the fundamental role of nuclear weapons. This, I think, will be one of the most important geopolitical questions that American statesmen and policymakers will face in the years and decades to come. And I look forward to discussing this and other issues with you more in the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. So we've gotten a number of questions, I think, in the chat. I want to remind folks, so if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button and then there's a Q&A button. If you put your questions in the Q&A button, it's easier for us to find them. But I think Austin and Andrew are on top of it so far, but please, if you can use the Q&A button, use it. So do you guys are you ready to start the question period? Thanks so much, Frank.
Sure, I'm fire away.
Very much.
Here we go.
I'm going to enjoy a glass of wine while you're at fire.
All right.
I got a question here from Andy Goodhart. He asks that you noted the return of great power competition with Russia and China and the pressure to spend scarce resources on new areas of technological competition. This is coming against the backdrop of pressure on DoD budgets and a shift to a one workforce planning construct. What are your thoughts on the utility of developing small yield nuclear weapons to address the gap between US commitments and capabilities? This is also a question interesting to Bethany and I as well, given some of our current work.
It's a great question, and there's a lot of different ways to answer it. And one of the frustrations I have with what might be called the nuclear studies community is that a question like that, which is a very important question, is sort of all contained within sort of the thinking about how nuclear strategy relates to non-proliferation and various commitments. I actually think we are in a period right now where fundamental questions about the nature of the international system are open. And that the sort of models we use to explain state behavior in the world, which I have this, I basically think all international relations theory turns on three historical questions. Why did World War I happen? Was Hitler unique? And how do nuclear weapons affect the international system? And all those questions are appropriate for a world where great power, war, and conquest made sense, and you could measure power by counting up population, looking at land features and resources, and seeing how a state could convert coal and steel into tanks and aircraft carriers. I don't think we live in that world anymore. I think, and not to be sort of to brush off the question, but I think we actually have to have a fundamental debate about the nature of what is driving this future competition. China is an interesting example here. China, a lot of people say, well, they're modernizing their nuclear weapons, they're doing this, they're doing far, far less than they could have, or they could. There's an argument that certainly within recent memory, they've not achieved mutual vulnerability. And my hypothesis in this, talking to nuclear scholars, is that or China scholars is the Chinese don't believe nuclear war is a possibility. And so when you sort of think this through and you say, okay, if China decides to take Taiwan, is their assumption that we would not use nuclear weapons in a conflict over Taiwan? And then we have to ask ourselves, is that assumption correct? And if that assumption is correct, if we're not going to use nuclear weapons in a war over Taiwan, and if China knows that we're not going to use them, then what are we doing with nuclear weapons? And you could make the same argument about, let's say, Article 5 commitments to the Baltics. I was in a Rand war game recently. And to me, these questions about low yield weapons, making them more usable, they're interesting at a certain level, but they punt on the core issue of what we think we're getting when we have these weapons. What do we hope? And if it turns out that it's based on a giant bluff, we ought to think about that, right? And so I wrote a paper recently on some of the contradictions within Thomas Schelling's work. And of course, Schelling is both the father of stability, he's also the father of coercion theory. And it makes literally no sense to be both, right? And the reason I started thinking about this is I was looking at this memo that he had written for President Kennedy in the summer of '61 in the Berlin crisis, when Kennedy was thinking long and hard, I'm in this impossible situation. I'm trying to defend a city in the middle of enemy territory with overwhelming Soviet Warsaw Pact conventional superiority, where I'd have to go on the offensive, right? I'd have to act first. And the only possible way I could win this is by exploiting my belief in my nuclear primacy, which means I would have to be willing to use them, which he didn't want to do, right? But he also knew if he said he wasn't going to use them, the city was completely exposed. So Schelling sends him this memo in the middle of this, essentially saying, look, Mr. President, what you should do is you're not going to use them preemptively. You're not going to use them sort of in a regional conflict. What you should use is you should send one, fire one somewhere in the Soviet Union, just one, just to signal that you're serious. And it's written in the margin earlier that he brought it to Hyannisport and he took this seriously. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, this has got to be the craziest effing thing I've ever heard. And if I'm Kennedy, I'm thinking like, and at that point, you're trying to say, well, what do these things do for me? They do nothing for me in Berlin, right? In 1961. And so then the question becomes, what do they do for me in my commitments in East Asia? What do they do for me for my commitments to NATO? And I think that's a question. So I know I frustrate people who think about that, but to me, it's the fundamental nature of how the international system works and what makes for power, and what are the risks of actual war, and what are the risks of actual escalation to something more, are the questions behind it. So.
All right, thank you. We have another question here from Michael Fluss, who asked that 3 of the 9 nuclear powers are developing countries or small countries, and their thoughts about the use of nuclear weapons is quite different than those of the U.S. For example, Israel's strategic and tactical planning regarding nuclear weapons is very different than the other 8 countries. How is this very real variation in national strategies taken into account when planning the U.S. strategy for nuclear weapons?
Another very good question. One of the key elements where America's strategies of inhibition were unsuccessful, where non-proliferation was very, very difficult, is anywhere where you had divided, contested territory. And so when you think about the Korean Peninsula, when you think about South Asia and the sort of brutal creation of the created both India and Pakistan, when you think about the creation of Israel and its sort of challenge, I think that when you have a state that either has contested sovereignty or disputed territorial claims, then the appeal of nuclear weapons is very strong. Meaning any place where invasion is and conquest is actually a real thing. So that's sort of the first point to make, that if you were to go to any of these, if you were to talk to the North Koreans, if you were to talk to India or Pakistan, if you were to talk to Israel, the strategic challenge they faced was fundamentally different. The other thing I would say is that we have a tendency to forget. One of the other things that I think Shelley and others made a mistake of is they looked at American nuclear strategy and expected every other state that developed nuclear weapons to develop the same strategies. My old colleague Deepened has written a brilliant book demonstrating how different states develop different technologies. But the reason, and this is what I tried to talk about in the presentation, the reason the United States had such high requirements, both in terms of a fairly hair trigger strategy and spending so much money on making nuclear weapons usable, was that in order to inhibit proliferation, which it wanted to do for a variety of its own grand strategic goals, it needed to at least move in the direction of primacy. If you're India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, you're not extending deterrence to anyone. Basically, what you're trying to do is either deter another state from using nuclear weapons against you, or occasionally deter a conventional attack upon you. It's a little bit more complicated. So it's a far different set of strategic assumptions that go into that. And one of the, if you want to sort of denuclearize those areas, what you need to do is resolve the underlying political tensions, right? I always ask my students, if you had a choice between getting rid of nuclear weapons in South Asia or resolving the underlying political disputes between India and Pakistan, what would you do? Well, of course, you'd do the latter, right? Because it's the latter that drives the former. And the problem is in South Asia, the Middle East, and the Korean Peninsula, in many ways, these underlying political tensions are unresolvable or difficult to resolve because they involve deeply contested notions of sovereignty. They're just very, very hard cases.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, what do you think about Matt Kroenig's arguments about nuclear superiority? And for those of us in the room who aren't familiar, could you also briefly mention what the arguments about nuclear superiority is?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying there's this puzzle that I mentioned in the talk. And that is, when you talk to many scholars who embrace the nuclear revolution school and assume that strategic stability was the goal of the United States, and even if it wasn't a goal, that mutual vulnerability was something that would just inevitably develop, and there was a natural progression from the strategic stability and mutual vulnerability to arms control treaties like SALT and ABM. There's this puzzle of what the United States was doing and the Soviet Union were doing after they signed these treaties, and spending all this money, not just on nuclear forces, but on counterforce damage limitation forces, which, when you think about them, can only be used first. And then the second puzzle is that not only that the United States was doing this, but the Soviet Union, if you look through the Soviet records, took this seriously. This worried them, because another thing that the theorist said was, okay, your adversary wants to buy these weapons, let them. They're wasting our money. But the adversary responded. The third puzzle, which we don't have an answer for, despite Matt's work, is how do you translate this quote unquote nuclear primacy, which is not a full-blown first strike, which is very hard to achieve, and even if it was, is dependent upon your willingness to use it. How does that translate into meaningful political leverage? And Matt's not the first to sort of wrestle with this. Again, when I went back to talk about Schelling had this inherent contradiction in that he said we need to have mutual vulnerability to have stability. That's the goal. Oh, and by the way, when we have mutual vulnerability and stability, here's the way to manipulate risk in order to achieve coercive political ends, which the second contradicts the first. And so the story of the United States with nuclear weapons is all about this schizophrenic sort of position. And the government had the same as Schelling, which is, yeah, we get mutual vulnerability and stability, and we think that's a good idea. That's why we signed these arms control treaties. On the other hand, we don't want mutual vulnerability and strategic stability. And the main reason we don't want them is because if we accepted strategic stability at this higher level, we would be unable to inhibit proliferation, meaning we'd live in a proliferated world, which would create another form of instability. So you could have strategic stability in a bilateral nuclear relationship, but then not have nuclear stability globally because you have a proliferated world. Or you could have instability at the higher level, but in order to achieve this other kind of stability. And that tension's always been there. So that's what the story is. Matt doesn't really get at the inhibition part. What Matt tries to demonstrate is that in various crises between nuclear powers, that having more weapons is better than having less. And there's been a lot of criticism of it. Matt has a tendency, it's like my old mentor, John Mearsheimer, that write in a certain way in order to generate it. No attention or controversy is bad attention or controversy. And there's some problems with the work. But I will give Matt credit in identifying the fact that the United States did seek nuclear superiority and that it believed there were tangible political benefits that could come from it. So, and I think from that perspective, it's an important contribution.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Drew Dixit. Thank you, Dr. Gavin and the NSSC for this interesting discussion. It seems like no state wants to use nuclear weapons. As you mentioned, nuclear weapons feel like an empty threat at this point against other states, especially against other nuclear states. Do you think this is because there is now more conflict against the non-state agents instead of opposing states, and in these conflicts, using nuclear weapons is not viable?
Another really good question. What I would say is that what you have to remember when nuclear weapons were developed, imagine you were someone like Bethany and you were working in a weapons lab. You were at Los Alamos, or you were at Livermore in 1943 or 1944. You were developing these weapons because you lived in a world that over the previous 30 years had seen unimaginable bloodletting, death, and destruction. You had seen ideologically driven revolutionary states dedicated to conquest, world domination, genocide on unspeakable levels. And while this was horrific, it was not completely out of step with how you understood human history. It was certainly an intensification of it, but it wasn't different. And so you were developing these weapons, both because you thought in a world of these kind of dangers, you needed to have these weapons, and if you didn't, somebody else would, and because the future was completely uncertain and terrifying. And I think we often forget. It's interesting and fascinating when you go back and revisit Truman's decisions to use the bomb in the summer of 1945. He didn't hesitate for a minute. And if you look into some of the war plans and if you study the war in the Pacific, I mean, it was just barbaric. And this is not to say the decision was right or wrong. It's just to say no American policymaker had a second of doubt, because the idea of invading the home islands of Japan, they felt would lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not more, Americans. The other policy of starving to Japan to death could have also led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. And that, even though the shock of the use of the bomb was so overwhelming, Bernard Brodie saying that the world has transformed, you're still in an environment where in your mind, what you're trying to imagine is a Hitler with a bomb or a Stalin acting like a Hitler with a bomb. And that world of unspeakable fear and danger. And that world has gone away. Now, has it gone away forever? I don't know. But I think what has happened is that the kind of baseline expectation, and I think this is interesting. I've been reading Fred Logevall's biography of JFK, and I've been thinking a lot about JFK. And if you look at this sort of Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we've probably come closest to nuclear use, I think what happens after the Cuban Missile Crisis is both the Soviets and Americans say, oh my God, we can never get that close again. We can never let that happen again. What's odd, though, is that instead of an instinct of trying to get rid of these weapons, you sort of kind of move into this mutual vulnerability, stability world. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. And you could argue, well, it worked because of deterrence. You could also argue that there were other things that prevented war from happening. And I think we now live in a world where that memory of total mobilized war that led to the deaths of tens of millions of people and regimes. I mean, we may complain about Xi or Putin, but they are not Mao, they're not Stalin, they're not Hitler. And there's not any sign of something like that moving forward. Also, when you look at what drove war in the late 19th and early and through the middle of the 20th century, you're talking about massively increasing populations who were worried, could we feed our populations? As I mentioned in the talk, we now live in a world of China's great challenge that it faces over the next 20 years is that it's getting to be old, right? It's going to be filled with a bunch of 60-year-olds. And nor is land the source of power it once was, nor is conquest and invasion a particularly attractive policy option. And so all of these things make you wonder about the utility of nuclear weapons. The great argument, to misquote the Paul Fussell phrase of "thank God for the atom bomb," was the idea that people fully expected a World War III to happen after World War II, and nuclear weapons dramatically disincentivized that. To me, that world is gone. Could it return? Yes. Could more dangerous worlds return? Yes. But the relevance of nuclear weapons to that world is harder for me to see. And honestly, and this, this horrifies all my sort of old school security studies friends, but this is where I'm less interested in arms control than I am in disarmament, nuclear disarmament. And part of it gets to the question is that you think about someone like Putin, who's made some pretty irresponsible statements about nuclear weapons in the last 5 or 6 years. Nobody takes him seriously, right? Because no one believes he would do it, right? And there's always that risk of miscalculation. There's always a lot of dangers that could emerge in a crisis. But that's what's so odd about nuclear weapons. They seem so unattached to many of the great sort of political questions of the day. This brings up to another question. I mean, is this horrendous COVID crisis we're going through is revealing that there's so many other, whether it's climate change, whether it's public health, whether it's international economic instability, whether it's migration, that the nature of the challenges that we face don't look anything like the ones people faced in 1950, where nuclear weapons seem to fit in very nicely with those challenges. Nuclear weapons do nothing for any of these other challenges. And so it's hard to know. It's hard to know how to think about them because they're both obviously catastrophically dangerous. They're lurking there in the background. They shape everything. But what I wonder is, as it becomes increasingly clear that no one will use them, the United States will not use them to defend Taiwan or Estonia. And if they're not going to use them then, no one's launching a bolt in the blue against the United States. They never were going to. And so then what do they do? What does deterrence do then? They're still obviously useful for countries that are worried about being invaded or conquered. That's why, to the previous question, why they're still relevant to the Korean Peninsula, why they're still relevant to the Middle East, and why they're still relevant to South Asia. But even over time, I wonder in those situations, again, I could be completely wrong about this, but I do think we're at one of these moments where these fundamental questions are on the table.
Perfect. Thanks, Frank. I'm going to use the prerogative of the moderator here to kind of bring the debate home and kind of ask what role you see for nuclear weapons in broader U.S. grand strategy amidst, I would say, a pretty vociferous debate between restrainers, deep engagers, offshore balancers. What role does this capability have to play, if any, in that debate?
So I don't know if you've seen this. I've gotten a bit involved in this debate as of late. And I'm of two minds of it. I generally think that the U.S. engagement with the world after the Second World War was writ large successful for a number of reasons. And there's any number of ways of looking at it. Some of it having to do with creating and stabilizing an international political system, international economic system. But most importantly, and this is something the restrainers never have an answer for, that by focusing on these strategies of inhibition, we live in a far less proliferated world because the United States has pursued such I don't want to use the word aggressive, but such an ambitious set of security arrangements. I think it's hard to deny in the counterfactual world that if you followed restraint, depending upon which restrainer you're talking to, if you'd followed it in 1940, 1945, 1990, today, that the odds are you would live in a more proliferated world. Now, there's some who don't think that's problematic, and Ken Waltz, of course, argued that wouldn't be problematic. Most of the restrainers, like Barry Posen and Steve Walt, they refuse to go that far. They kind of want their cake and eat it too. They want to limit proliferation, but they want to limit America's engagement with the world. And I just think that it's fine to sort of talk about restraint, but for those states who feel exposed to a volatile international security environment, particularly those who might feel vulnerable to conquest, they're going to be tempted to get nuclear weapons. That being said, the conference you and I were at in Hamburg in December, I was really struck by Ulrich Kuhn's fascinating public policy work that actually demonstrated that the Germans, who were, the reason this all began was because of the United States trying to deal with the German problem, right? Because you had West Germany, you wanted them to reintegrate into Western Europe, you wanted them to participate in the defense of Western Europe, but you couldn't let them have nuclear weapons. It's an enormous political problem. And it was kind of the ground zero for extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella, and its success there spread elsewhere. Well, judging by his research, it didn't seem like the Germans cared very much anymore. And so I am open to the argument that because of my previous answer about changing norms and the lack of utility of nuclear weapons for many of our current challenges, I think 30 years ago, a less engaged United States would have led to more proliferation. Today, I don't know, right? I mean, to me, the great test case of this will be Japan. And there's a lot of concern in Japan about the reliability of the United States. There's a lot of discussion about developing, about the long-range strike and things like that. I see less interest in energy devoted to thinking about developing independent nuclear weapons than my own argument would suggest. So maybe not now, but eventually a lower US presence wouldn't necessarily lead to a proliferated world. Now, the restraint argument and the engage argument covers a whole, it's not just about proliferation. And it's an impossible question to answer ex ante, right? But I think whereas 10 years ago, I would have thought that a vigorous American forward engagement was absolutely critical to global nonproliferation. Today, I still think it's important, but I'm open to the argument that it may, in certain cases, not be as critical as we once thought, largely because of developing norms and because of declining utility of nuclear weapons in a variety of circumstances. And I think, if you remove then the extended deterrent requirements for the United States, that does open the possibility for more interesting, more vigorous move towards nuclear disarmament than would have ever been thought possible. But anyway, these are guesses rather than, because we can't know.
All right, looking at the time there, that is a perfect 7 o'clock, so we'll have to bring this to a close. I apologize to anybody whose wonderful questions went unanswered in chat. And I wanted to, on behalf of NPWG, to thank Frank Gavin for his excellent talk and discussion here. Thank you so much. It was really informative, and I think we all learned a lot.
It was a ton of fun. Thank you all for putting up with me at this hour.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, so much, Frank. It's a pleasure to have you. And to all the people that we didn't have time to get to your questions, we really appreciate the engagement. And so we strongly encourage you to join us at a future NPWG event. We'll pass these on to Frank. Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Well, thanks. That was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was great.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
I feel bad you had to sit through 2 different versions twice of this, so you were good.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. It was, having seen the first, we were looking for a keynote, and I thought it was really appropriate. So it was great. And I mean, 50 folks to get on